The 1970s produced the most gloriously unhinged automobiles in American history. We're not talking about the muscle cars. Everybody talks about the muscle cars. We're talking about something stranger and honestly more interesting: the features, the decisions, the ideas that engineers and designers and corporate committees cooked up, put into production, sold to millions of Americans, and then quietly killed. No press release, no apology, no explanation. Here today, gone by 1980. Sometimes gone by Tuesday. 10 features, 10 decisions. Some were killed by regulation, some by lawsuits, some by public outrage so intense that Congress actually had to step in. And one, I promise you, was killed because the American people simply refused to comply. Today, we find out why. The seatbelt interlock. Let's start with the one that got Congress so many angry letters they compared it to Watergate. That is not an exaggeration. It's 1974. You slide into your brand new Ford Torino. You put the key in the ignition, you turn it. Nothing. The car won't start because you forgot to buckle your seatbelt. That was the seatbelt interlock system, mandated by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration for all 1974 model year cars. Simple idea. If the front seats were occupied and the belts weren't fastened, the car simply would not start. The logic was bulletproof. The execution was a disaster. The system used logic modules complex enough that they required special diagnostic computers to repair when they failed, and they failed constantly. Owners found themselves stranded in their own driveways because the sensor decided a bag of groceries in the passenger seat counted as a person. Some people figured out workarounds: pre-buckle the belt before sitting down, then sit on top of it. That defeated the whole system. So NHTSA had to design it to know the difference. The belt had to be fastened after the occupants sat down. The buzzer. That buzzer. If you remember it, you can hear it right now. A relentless, maddening tone that refused to stop until you buckled up. And remember, only about 20% of Americans were wearing seatbelts at this point. The other 80% were experiencing this buzzer as a personal attack. Congress acted with unusual speed. In 1974, the same year the cars appeared, they passed legislation explicitly banning the interlock and further mandating that the belt warning buzzer could only last 8 seconds. 8 seconds! They wrote the maximum buzzer duration into federal law. The seatbelt interlock lasted exactly 1 model year, the most legislated car feature in American history, dead by 1975. The 85-mile-per-hour speedometer. Picture the speedometer on your car right now. Probably goes to 120, maybe 140. Now imagine the government deciding that number was dangerous, that merely seeing a high number on your dashboard would tempt you to drive at that speed. That was the actual logic behind the 85-mile-per-hour speedometer. In 1979, with the fuel crisis in full force and the national speed limit locked at 55 miles per hour, the double nickel they called it, NHTSA issued a regulation requiring that 85 miles per hour be the maximum speed displayed on all new car speedometers, and that the 55 mile per hour mark be shown in a distinct red to emphasize it as the limit. The theory was psychological. If drivers couldn't see 100 or 120 on their gauge, they'd be less inspired to reach for those numbers. In practice, all it accomplished was making the speedometer completely useless the moment you got on a highway and actually wanted to know how fast you were going above 85. The regulation also carried a whiff of condescension that Americans did not particularly appreciate. The car could go faster than 85. Everyone knew it. The speedometer just refused to admit it. By 1982, the Reagan administration, running on a deregulation platform, scrapped the requirement. Speedometers returned to their honest 3-digit ambitions. The 85-mile-per-hour era had lasted just 3 years, a brief, puzzling parenthesis in American automotive history. The pillarless hardtop.
Here's something worth mourning. Roll down the windows on a pillarless hardtop, a real one from 1970 or 71, and what you get is a car with no visible division between the front and rear windows. Pure, uninterrupted glass and air from one end to the other. The roof floated above you like a hat with nothing underneath it. It looked like a convertible that had simply decided to stay closed. The pillarless hardtop had been the dominant body style in American luxury cars through the 1950s and 60s. At its peak, the two-door hardtop outsold the conventional four-door sedan on models like the Chevrolet Impala. Families chose this car. This was the mainstream. Then, the federal government started tightening roof crush standards, rollover protection requirements. The pillarless body, inherently less rigid than a pillared car, designed to look open and free rather than to withstand a barrel roll, could not meet what was coming without being fundamentally redesigned. Automakers didn't want to pay for the redesign, so they killed the style instead. They replaced it with a trick, a cosmetic lie. They kept the B-pillar, the structural post between the front and rear doors, but painted it black and tucked it behind tinted glass so you couldn't quite see it. The hardtop look without the hardtop. You've been looking at fake hardtops ever since.
The vinyl roof. If the 1970s had a signature, it was probably a vinyl roof. There's something magnificent about a full, padded Landau vinyl top on a 1975 Lincoln Continental Mark IV. The pleated texture catching the afternoon sun, the opera window cut into the padded C-pillar, the whole car radiating a specific, unashamed confidence that said, "This is luxury, and I do not care what you think about it." The vinyl roof was part practical, part theater. When the pillarless hardtop began disappearing in the early 1970s, automakers needed something to give their newly pillared cars the illusion of open-air elegance. The vinyl roof was the answer. It evoked a convertible's fabric top. It added texture and color contrast. It turned an ordinary coupe into something that looked like it belonged outside a hotel. The problem was underneath. Moisture crept under the vinyl. It pooled against the steel roof. In a humid summer, in the heat of a closed garage, the steel underneath rusted quietly, invisibly, until the day you peeled back the vinyl and found a catastrophe. Entire roof panels rotting away beneath perfect-looking exteriors. By the mid-1980s, the vinyl roof had largely disappeared, done in by its own hidden damage and by a shift in taste toward the cleaner European aesthetic. Some survived, most rotted. The ones that are still out there, still intact, they are worth finding. The 5-mile-an-hour bumper. In 1972, a Pontiac GTO had a front bumper that looked like jewelry. Chrome, sculpted, hugging the body of the car like it belonged there. In 1974, the same car had what looked like a railroad tie bolted to its face. What happened in between was the NHTSA's 5-mile-an-hour bumper standard, a federal regulation requiring that bumpers survive a direct impact at 5 miles per hour without damage. The idea was to reduce low-speed repair costs. The result was a generation of cars disfigured by massive overhanging slabs of black rubber and steel that looked like they'd been designed by someone who had never seen a car before. Designers who had spent their careers sculpting automobiles like works of art were handed a blunt object and told to make it fit. Some managed it gracefully. The 1973 Corvette's body-color urethane nose is arguably still iconic. The Pontiac Firebird handled it with some dignity. The Camaro got a shovel nose that haunted it for years. Most cars were less fortunate. In 1982, Reagan's administration rolled back the standard from 5 miles per hour to 2.5 miles per hour, and the massive impact bumpers began to shrink. Eventually, they were tucked under body-colored covers entirely. Today, you can't even see your car's bumper.
The overreaction had been overcorrected, and somewhere in the middle, the original chrome beauty was lost forever.
The floor-mounted dimmer switch. Your left foot remembers this even if your brain doesn't. In virtually every American car from the 1940s through the mid-1970s, the switch for toggling between low beams and high beams was not on a stock behind the steering wheel. It was a small, round metal button on the floor, driver's side left of the clutch if you had one. You operated it with your foot. Press once for high beams, press again for low. Hand stayed on the wheel the entire time. There is an argument, a genuinely good argument, that this was more ergonomically sensible than what replaced it. Your hands never left the wheel, your foot was already down there doing nothing on a straight highway at night. It worked. What killed it wasn't safety, it was salt. In the northern states, road salt tracked into the car on boots and shoes corroded the floor-mounted wiring over time. The switch became unreliable, and as steering columns became increasingly sophisticated, turn signal stalks, cruise control, eventually wiper controls, all migrating up to the column, it made sense to consolidate everything together. By 1980, the floor dimmer switch was essentially gone from American production cars, replaced by the column stalk that every driver uses today. Logical, efficient, and somehow, for reasons that are hard to articulate, a little less satisfying. The opera window. We need to talk about the opera window. In case you've never encountered this term, an opera window was a small fixed porthole cut into the C-pillar of a car, usually framed by a padded vinyl roof, often with the car's name etched into it in elaborate script. The idea, borrowed from horse-drawn carriages of the 19-teens, was that distinguished passengers riding in the rear could peer out at their surroundings in a manner befitting a night at the opera. By 1973, practically every American personal luxury car had one. The Lincoln Continental Mark IV made it elegant, the Dodge Charger SE made it aggressive, the Mercury Cougar made it large. By the time the idea spread to economy compacts, the opera window had traveled very far from its distinguished origins. Wikipedia lists approximately 80 cars that were produced with opera windows during the 1970s. 80! The concept jumped from Lincoln to GM to Chrysler to Ford to AMC and even briefly appeared bewilderingly on a Toyota Carina van in 1975, a delivery van with an opera window. What killed the opera window wasn't regulation, it wasn't a lawsuit, it was taste. By 1982, the angular European aesthetic had arrived, clean lines, no ornament, aerodynamic simplicity. Against that new aesthetic, the opera window looked like something from another century, because it was. They disappeared quietly, the way excess usually does, not with a bang, but with a collective flinch.
The factory 8-track player. The 8-track player was the factory-installed audio system of the 1970s American automobile, and it had exactly one fatal flaw. It changed tracks whenever it felt like it. Here's how it worked. An 8-track cartridge contained a single continuous loop of magnetic tape divided into 4 stereo programs. The player moved from program to program automatically. The machine did not care whether you were in the middle of a song. It didn't care if you were in the middle of a word. When the program ended, there was a loud mechanical clunk. Some described it as a sound like a staple gun, and the music resumed several seconds later, possibly mid-chorus. For approximately 7 years, between 1966 and the early 70s when they peaked, this was considered acceptable. The 8-track had been championed by Bill Lear of Learjet fame, who saw it as the future of mobile audio and convinced Ford to offer it as a factory option in 1966. Within a few years, GM, Chrysler, and AMC followed. By the mid-1970s, the 8-track was standard in most American luxury cars. The cassette tape killed it. Smaller, more reliable, better sound, and crucially, it played the whole song through. By the early 1980s, the 8-track had vanished from factory options. The last factory-installed 8-track in an American car appeared in a 1982 model. By then, even the most nostalgic holdout had moved on. The vent window. Long before every car came with air conditioning, there was the vent window. And depending on who you ask, the vent window might have been a more satisfying solution. The vent window, also called a wing window or quarter light, was the small triangular pane of glass in the front corner of each door window. It pivoted open on a vertical axis, typically with a small chrome latch. When angled into the airflow, it acted as a scoop, channeling a direct column of outside air at the driver or passenger without buffeting the entire interior. You could direct it precisely. You could feel exactly the amount of air you wanted. On a long summer highway drive in 1972, with both front vent windows angled forward and the main windows cracked a few inches, the interior of a car was genuinely comfortable. Not air-conditioned, but comfortable in a way that felt like the natural world cooperating with you, rather than being replaced by a machine. There was a smell to it, warm asphalt and cut grass and whatever was growing alongside the interstate. Air conditioning removes that. The vent window preserved it. What killed the vent window was aerodynamics. As fuel efficiency became a federal priority after 1973, automakers redesigned body shapes for lower drag. The vent window, with its external hinge and pivot mechanism, disrupted the clean airflow across the door. Removing it saved a small but measurable amount of fuel. And by then, air conditioning was cheap enough to become standard. The vent window was redundant. It disappeared from most American cars by the mid-1980s. The last mainstream holdout was the pickup truck, where vent windows survived into the early 90s. If you know, you know.
The motorized automatic seatbelt. We've come full circle. We started with a feature that prevented your car from starting until you buckled up. We end with the feature that decided to buckle you up whether you wanted it to or not. After the seatbelt interlock disaster of 1974, NHTSA spent years trying to figure out how to protect passengers who simply refused to wear seatbelts. Their answer arrived in the late 1970s, the passive restraint, a seatbelt that required no action from the occupant, a seatbelt that did it for you. In practice, this meant a shoulder belt mounted to a motorized track running along the top of the door frame. When you opened the door, the belt retracted. When you closed the door, it motored forward along the track and settled across your chest automatically. You were buckled in. By the car. Without consent. The lap belt still had to be fastened manually. Many passengers didn't bother, which meant that in an actual crash, the shoulder belt held you in place at the top while nothing held you at the bottom, creating what safety researchers politely called a submarine risk, the passenger sliding forward and under the belt entirely. Others pointed out that in a car fire, the motorized belt might trap the occupant in the car. Car makers added a manual release latch. Drivers immediately disconnected it and left it disconnected. The passive restraint was, in practice, no restraint at all. The motorized belt survived into the early 1990s, outlasting almost everything else on this list before being phased out as airbags became standard and actual seatbelt use finally began to rise. Its last appearance in a major American production car was 1993. It was ridiculous. It was earnest. It was a machine trying, in its clunky way, to protect you, much like the decade that invented it.